Hey folks, Zach Osterman, I am Insider Indianapolis Star. Forgive my sort of sweaty and flushed look. I just got back from Little Five. Indiana picks up it's probably fair to say, not unexpected commitment this afternoon from Kanaan Carlyle, the Stanford guard, originally from the Atlanta area, who's on an official visit to IU this weekend. It's probably fair to say this was, I don't know if anything's ever expected in the portal, but this certainly was one of those where it felt like the wind was blowing firmly in one direction, particularly after Indiana added Miles Rice, who's also from the Atlanta area, had Ja'Kai Newton, who's also from the Atlanta area. Rice, Newton, and Carlisle are all kind of from different parts of Atlanta, but, there did seem to be sort of a sense of kind of togetherness around, having multiple guys from that area. Carlisle's an interesting player. He averaged double figures in scoring for Stanford as a freshman last season. He also averaged, I think, 2.7 assists and 2.7 rebounds. He wasn't particularly efficient. Effective field goal percentage was just 46%, 44.3% on twos, 32%, a clean 32 out of 100 on threes, although he did shoot slightly better in Pac-12 play, 34.5% from three in Pac-12 play. The most efficient parts of his game were that, number one, he got fouled quite a bit. He drew the seventh most fouls per 40 minutes of any player in the Pac-12 in conference games. And he hit a bunch of his free throws, 77.6% on the year, 78.1% against Pac-12 opponents. He also just has an interesting profile because Stanford asked him to do a lot last year. He actually had a higher assist rate in conference play and a higher usage rate in conference play. And a higher percentage of shots taken in conference play than he had overall. So basically, he had the third highest possession usage number in the Pac-12 in league games, 12th in percentage of shots, 11th in assist rate. So basically, Stanford actually, as the season wore on, and I think Carlisle missed about the first month of the season, but as the season wore on, Stanford actually asked him to not just shoot more, but also distribute more, handle the ball more, just generally basically run the show more. For a player who's not necessarily an out-and-out point guard, I think he's got those playmaking tools, but he's not necessarily someone you would look at and, you'd label, Miles Rice or Xavier Johnson a point guard. I don't know that you would label Kanaan Carlyle quite the same way, but Stanford asked that of him as last season wore on. He had some good moments. He had 31 in a game against Washington State, 22 in a game against Oregon State, 28 against Arizona in a win at home. It did look, if you're just looking purely at sort of his percentages, on a per game basis, his points totals, it did feel a little bit like maybe he kind of hit a bit of a freshman wall last season. But it's also interesting because Indiana probably wouldn't ask him to do quite as much as what Stanford did. That Indiana would probably still make use of his playmaking ability, his spot-up shooting ability, his free throw shooting ability. They just would, sort of lessen that burden a little bit, at least in terms of these numbers. You'd be surprised, bar some kind of crazy injury crisis or Kanaan Carlyle just exploding, for example, to see him with the third highest usage rate in Big Ten games in the conference next winter, when he's going to be playing with a Miles Rice and, a Trey Galloway and a Gabe Cupps and, whoever else. Indiana's still, I think, pursuing some backcourt depth for shooting purposes. In particular, Connor Essegian's a big name there. Forgive me, I've been kind of out of pocket this afternoon because of the race. I was doing some coaching, but I'm literally, if you'd like to see how the sausage is made, I'm literally just searching on Twitter. I don't believe he's committed yet. I do think there's a strong feeling that he's leaning toward Nebraska, but I don't think that not getting Connor Essegian would stop Indiana pursuing, another player kind of in that mold in terms of a shooter. But it's fair to say with a player like Carlisle, you may not be talking about a player that's maybe asked to be quite so immersed in everything the way Stanford did. But you are certainly talking about a player that's going to see a lot of minutes, going to see a lot of the ball. I think there's probably a reasonable argument for the idea that, for example, Carlisle can go from a 32% three-point shooter to a 36% three-point shooter, maybe even a 38% three-point shooter, if he's not having to do so much, work on the ball, if he's maybe allowed to move around and hunt shots and so forth a little bit more off the ball. I mean, and it's worth saying too. I mean, he attempted 100 threes last season and 115 twos. It's not like there wasn't volume to his offense. We got a good sample size for a player who's a freshman. There are a lot of tools to work with here. I think that's probably what you'd feel like if you were Indiana. I think justifiably you would look at this player and you would say there's a lot of different ways that he can potentially impact winning. He doesn't necessarily have to carry maybe quite as much of the load as he did at Stanford, but there's still a lot to like. And if his freshman year was just kind of the beginning of maybe teasing a higher ceiling, then so be it. But one way or the other, this is a player that Indiana's targeted for a long time in this portal cycle. He had this visit set up for a long time, and again, I mean, bar kind of maybe that early salvo you get with every player around. This player's gone in the portal and they've heard from this long list of schools. There was really never any buzz about anybody but Indiana. Not in a really firm way. Not to say that other schools weren't recruiting him or weren't involved, but it always felt like, for whatever reason, it always felt like Indiana got sort of put a head above everybody else. And, why that is, time may tell, one way or the other. It's fair to say that Indiana prioritized Kanaan Carlyle from very, very early on in this process, and Indiana's going to wind up taking his commitment as a result. So that's 3 for the Hoosiers. That's 3 for the Hoosiers in this class. Including 2, big backcourt commits and Umar Ballo, and we'll see, kind of where Mike Woodson goes, if they can get Connor Season. If they can't, what does that lead to? We'll find out. But Kanaan Carlyle in the fold, that's kind of the news for tonight. We'll leave it there. For the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Talk to you soon.